welcome to this Hamway Festival session on outsider art. The term outsider art has a long association with the mental health care field, historically and currently, that we're going to explore in this session. We've got a great session lined up for you, combining insights from art, from psychology, from public health, from psychiatry. And first I'm going to start by giving you a short presentation about outsider art, telling you a bit about its origins and its links to mental health care. That will be followed by a film featuring UK artist Jan Arden, a panel discussion, a presentation on poetry in prison settings, and there'll be lots of time for questions and discussion. So please do send your comments and questions through using the chat function. So now I'm going to share my screen with you and give you a presentation to introduce the topic. Okay, so in this session, I'm going to explore the meaning of the term outsider art, its origins and its connection to the history of mental health care, and also to argue why the art should play an important role in the care of people with mental health problems. I'm going to do this by providing some background to the field of outsider art and describing some of the key historic moments in its inception, linked to the development of mental health care in Europe. I'm then going to discuss the wider therapeutic role of art for mental health and its influence beyond healthcare in training healthcare professionals and also in promoting social justice. And I wanted to make a note about the language that I use in this presentation. Some of the material I use is historically situated, so some of the language may not be what we would consider politically correct in a contemporary sense. So what is outsider art? The term outsider art was coined by the late British art historian Roger Cardinal in his seminal 1972 text that you can see here on the right of the slide. The term often refers to art that exists outside of traditional artistic categories, and it's often made by those who have no formal artistic training. Outsider art builds on the tradition of folk, naive, primitive, and vernacular traditions of art, and they're influenced by culture, history, and social contexts. The work is often characterized by elements such as childlike images, repetition, obsessionality, complex systems, and the use of unconventional materials, for example, found or discarded objects. Cardinal's work very much built on the term art brut, which was devised by the French artist Jean de Buffet in 1945. And he used this term to designate art that was considered raw or outside of conventional artistic tradition. De Buffet traveled through Europe in the 30s and 40s, collecting art made by patients in psychiatric institutions and in prisons. And he later shared his findings with his artistic contemporaries in Paris. The collection that he accumulated was gifted to the city of Lausanne in Switzerland in 1971, where it has since been held in the wonderful collection de l'Art Brut. Now, Cardinal recognized the problematic nature of the term outsider art, and other terms, for example, folk art or self-taught artist, are often preferred. In fact, many artists recognized within the genre of outsider art may not consider themselves artists at all, as their output is very much created for personal and private reasons. Often people from this genre are unmotivated by discovery, by exhibition, or even to share their work with others. The field of outsider art is often associated with individuals who may be described as neurodiverse or who experience mental and physical health challenges. And this is a subject that I investigated in an exhibition that I co-curated in 2013 called Art in the Asylum, where we particularly looked at the long association of art made by people who are untrained with the development of mental health care that we recognize in a Western context today. Thousands of people visited this exhibition and provided a really interesting platform to engage in dialogue about the history of mental health care and some of the contemporary dilemmas and issues experienced by people who may have mental distress in the contemporary world. We also looked at the reception of art made by people from mental health institutions into the wider cultural sphere, for example, by artists from the Surrealist movement. So I'm going to share a couple of these key events and key individuals with you, and then move on to focus on the importance of art to mental health. There are very early reports of patients in psychiatric institutions being engaged in art. For example, in the early 19th century, a patient from the Cork County Asylum in Ireland was noted to be drawing on the wall and seemed to be really amused, and his mood changed in a positive way when he was involved in that artistic activity. Interestingly, perhaps one of the earliest known formal introductions of art to mental health care was up in Scotland in the UK by this gentleman that you see on the slide, Dr. W.A.F. Brown, who was the medical superintendent at the Crichton Royal Institution. Brown was an early proponent of the moral treatment of those with mental illness, and he was the first documented clinician who not only encouraged patients to paint and draw, but he also avidly collected and analysed their work, writing a treatise about this. For him, artistic activity was not simply a pleasant diversion, it was deeply therapeutic. It was part of the liberal education of each individual, providing solace and acting as an instrument for the removal of disease. He even encouraged patients to teach each other. And the hospital reports commented on the importance of this activity, for example, stating that drawing had been prescribed as a medicine in 4 cases and appeared to be curative in 2. One of the patients that was treated at the Crichton Royal Institution was a man called William Bartholomew, and you see his work here on this slide. Bartholomew, before he was admitted to the Crichton, was employed as an engraver and a hat maker, and he was admitted to the hospital with in an acute state of mania marked by hallucinations. After admission, he was noted to become settled after starting to draw, and these are a couple of examples of large-scale portraits that he made of fellow patients. These were a collaboration with Dr. Brown, the superintendent, and we see here how art can be informative in training healthcare professionals, as Brown is likely to have used these large-scale portraits whilst lecturing medical and nursing staff. There's also evidence that art has been used in the development of understanding and treatment of mental illness. And the images you see on this slide are the result of an experiment by Drs. Gutman and Maclay from the Maudsley Hospital and the Bethlehem Hospitals in London, both sites of some key developments in the diagnostic use of art made by psychiatric patients. These experiments coincide with wider interests in neuroscience and visual perception. And it was thought that these pictures might convey information about patients' disturbance and illness progression. Interestingly, the collaboration was between patients and also well-known artists like the English surrealist Julian Trevelyan, whose work you see on the right-hand side of the slide. And the idea was that patients and artists were administered mescaline, a psychedelic drug, in order to better understand the experience of psychosis. Moving on to the Netherton Hospital in Surrey. In 1946, an artist called Edward Adamson was employed at the Netherton Hospital. And from his work there, which was very much non-directive, so providing patients in the hospital with space and materials to paint and to draw and to sculpt, the idea of art therapy was born. And this image that you see is by one of the female patients at the hospital called Mary Bishop. And this graphic, emotive work was recognized for its educational properties as well as aesthetic properties. So her work was later used in mental health campaigns to raise awareness about mental illness. Around the same time as some of these developments were happening, in the art world, there were a series of quite pivotal exhibitions held in Paris and in London, showcasing the work of patients from psychiatric hospitals alongside notable artists from, for example, the expressionist and surrealist traditions. And this cemented the importance of art made by people in mental health institutions and its wider acceptance in the cultural scene, and also its influence on mainstream artistic movements and on artists within those movements. The field of outsider art now is very well established. There's annual commercial art fairs in Paris and in London. There are artist showcases in Venice at the Biennale, and work changing hands for large sums of money. For example, for superstar artists from this genre, such as the Mexican artist Martin Ramirez, whose work you see here. He was a Mexican artist who was confined in the US mental health system. In terms of social justice, it's worth considering the wider influence of art made by people with mental health challenges. Since 2014, when I worked in Nottingham at the Institute of Mental Health, we started a series of exhibitions. The exhibitions focused on varied themes, including recovery from mental illness, depression, incarceration, psychiatric medication. And these types of opportunities give people with mental health issues a chance to share and showcase their work, providing inclusive and positive opportunities. For some people, this is the first time they have shown their work, and it can be transformative, providing not only an opportunity for catharsis, but also to transform their identity and discover a new artistic identity, allowing them to showcase their abilities and skills rather than focusing on pathology or illness. I would argue that art has an even more powerful influence in terms of exerting strategic influence with high-level policy makers. So this image you see is when we took art from the Adamson collection, and this is the collection of Edward Adamson, which is held by the Wellcome Library in London. We took some work to the Houses of Parliament, and this is the home of the UK government, where it helped raise the issue of mental health with government ministers. And this demonstrates not only the power of art to evoke an aesthetic response, but also to explore elements of the human condition, providing an external stimulus that can evoke internal engagement in cognitive and affective domains, but also engaging relationality and empathy with the artists who make this work. So I wanted to conclude by saying that I hope this presentation gives an introduction to the power and utility of art in mental health care, to challenge stigma, to showcase the ability of people who make the work, and to enhance diversity and inclusion in the wider community, as well as the art field. Art made by those with mental health problems provides deep and rich insight into the experience of mental distress, and provides a means to support those experiencing mental health problems, to enrich their lives, and also to educate and support those who work in mental health care, as well as raising awareness of mental health in the wider community. Thank you. So thank you for your attention. And now I'd like to introduce a film, which is an interview that I made with a UK-based artist called Arden. If you could show that film now.
In terms of my father was very abusive and aggressive and alcoholic, womanizer and whatnot. And so I suffered a lot of heavy physical, mental and emotional abuse to the point where I was hospitalized. But that whole, I don't have no memory of that. My sister had to fill me in 2009. Out of the blue, I went to visit her in Ireland and she said, "Oh, this happened to you." And I thought, what? My mouth kind of dropped and I thought, oh, that makes sense why I've had so many problems and so many difficulties. But I've spent these last 12 years kind of really going through therapy and going through transformation and getting in touch with that traumatic child, you know, and it's been quite a heavy journey. But from the 5, I was always drawing as an escape. Mm-hmm. My father used to lock me in the attic room because I was very, not erratic, but I was quite playful and quite cheeky and so on. My father couldn't manage that. So I was the one who took all the anger and aggression out of all the children, my father focused it all on me. So I ended up in the attic. So in the attic, I used to draw. So my escape was to draw things. So I used to draw pretty much similar to what I'm doing now, in actual fact. And I can remember when I was at school, maybe 7 or 8 years of age, I won my first competition for art. I won The Hobbit by Tolkien. That was my first prize. And I thought, now I think, why did I get that particular prize? Because I was drawing creatures. I was drawing kind of fantasy creatures and so on. I remember that very distinctly. And so the teacher thought, oh, we'll give him The Hobbit, because that's all about fantasy and goblins and so on. So I was really drawing these creatures. But then I got into comic books, and I was drawing things from comic books like Spider-Man and so on. I really love comic books, and so I was copying things, Disney characters, copying. And so when I went to school, I studied art, and I started just drawing things. I was able to draw anything, you know, portrait, landscape, whatever, you know, still life, you know, that was my whole thing. I was drawing. But unfortunately, I didn't go into art college. I went into the entertainment business instead. And it wasn't until 2009 that I came full circle when I started having my breakdown. And I came full circle, and I thought, how can I manage and cope with this? And someone suggested, well, just draw like you were doing before. You know, just draw anything you're interested in. Just draw, just get the pencil and paper and just start. So I started drawing sort of shamanic things, shields for Native American shield with feathers and so on. And I still got that work. And and then it got a bit abstract, and I was using color, and I did a pastel drawing class doing horses and whatnot, but none of that really kind of interested me. I wanted to just sit and just express myself on the paper with a pen, you know, mainly because that's all I could afford at the time, was paper and a pen. And then I just thought I'd just scribble over the page, and whatever I could see on the page. If I see an arm or leg, I'm just going to draw it. I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to start meditating on what's happening here or give it a title or whatever. I'm just going to go explore the journey. So literally, I was just sitting there all day long, just drawing a picture, and I'd finish one, put it aside, another piece of paper, do it again, finish, another piece of paper, do it again. And I never, ever go back and look at my work.
To talk a bit more about your inspirations, you mentioned shamanism and folklore and your African ancestry. Can you say a bit more about what inspires your art?
Well, what's interesting about folk art, people produced art for ceremony. And in certain parts of Africa, they produce pieces of artwork in order to summon and to get in touch with an animal or an ancestral spirit or something. And they create this piece of work, and they're totally absorbed, and they practice these movements and dances to really invoke within themselves the spirit of the ancestor and the energy of the ancestor. And sometimes they get hurt, and the crowds get hurt because they really get into it. So when I heard about that, I thought, you know, that is really amazing. And I did study. I love the artwork of Benin, and the Benin bronzes in the British Museum, and the simplicity. They're not trying to produce an exact likeness of someone. I mean, that's what really interests me. They're not trying to get everything in proportion, but it's just an image. Someone's created an image. I mean, that's what's interesting about folk art. You would think, well, even back in the day, tribal art, they never really produced anything which was an exact image of someone. You know, and it's interesting. I just was thinking about that recently. You know, so I really like the folk art. They're kind of very simplistic. You know, someone's artistic, creative. They're producing ancestral pieces. They're produced for family and friends. You know, they're producing something which is very sacred to them, not something which they think, oh, do you know what? I'm going to produce 50 of those and I'll sell them in the market. You know, they're producing something which would have been in their home. Nowadays, they're doing that, of course, and they would have done that to a certain extent for religious and ritual purposes, like in ancient Egypt. There was a market for various bits and pieces to be people buried with and so on. Even the artists who painted within the tombs, they were a whole family. They were being paid to create that. But even that is just so beautiful and very simplistic, but yet very powerful. You know, very powerful. And I have done some ayahuasca ceremonies. specifically to get in touch with my own trauma, but also partly to get in touch with my ancestral, my ancestors, my African ancestors.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really powerful, having that conversation, having that connection,
mm-hmm.
And putting to rest a lot of ancestral trauma. And so my art now takes on that, you know. It's especially when I'm doing a lot of figures where they're actually traveling somewhere and they're covered with animals and designs and so on and so forth. And there's a sense of journey. It's like none of the figures have arrived anywhere. It's only now, I never get to talk about this, Victoria, you know. It's only now when I'm stimulated, I think, well, that's interesting that they always seem to be traveling somewhere or going somewhere, but not really arriving.
So the destination is unknown, or you haven't yet got there?
Well, I haven't really got there yet, have I? You know, it's like Giacometti says, you know, he's on this journey and he's working at it. He doesn't know if he's arrived yet. You know, I guess it's a kind of perfectionist in me. Like this guy who wanted me to do some commissioned work for him. I said, I'm going to do 6 pieces, 3 and 3, and then you choose one of each of the theme, because that's how I work. Because I don't want to think I've got to sit here and do one particular drawing. I've got to just sit and just see how I feel. I had to watch Bat Boy the musical to get an idea of the imagery, and then just see, okay, I don't want to get too much into it. And I saw Equus when I was at school, and so I kind of know about Equus, the kind of story. But he sent me loads of photos because the imagery is quite interesting. You know, John Napier was the guy who designed.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting. You know, it's interesting to see to connect with that African ancestry. It's a very kind of dynamic ancestry. And in terms of movement, in terms of culture, in terms of the richness of the culture and the richness of the ritual and the philosophy that went with it and so on.
Which part of Africa are your ancestors from?
They would have come from West Africa, probably Nigeria.
How your artistic style changed as you recovered from your breakdown. Can you say a bit more about that?
Well, the intensity, I was in treatment for 18 months doing group therapy and one-on-one therapy. And so it was a very intense time for me. And so I just wanted to feel everything, the whole page. I wanted to just really kind of explore and have a lot to do, you know, so it made it really complex. But as I recovered, it became less complex and more kind of, okay, let's make it more personal now. You know, instead of the chaos or you know, the disassociation, start getting, you know, really personal, drawing personal figures and so on. And then people said, why don't you color them in? And it didn't really work. I did try to use color, but color just didn't work for me. So I'm not ready for color yet. So I did color in some of the black and white, and I kept it. I didn't think, oh my God, that looks awful. I thought, well, that's interesting. That was part of the journey. And then I started using color, and it was really vibrant. But using color, it's all about what color combines with what.
What do you think about this term outsider art? Because your work sort of gets put under that banner, doesn't it?
Well, I've been thinking about it recently, and I was thinking, you know, I mean, what would you call someone in an African village producing this? They were producing this work. They would be called folk artists. I mean, I really prefer the term folk artist because I never trained as an artist. Although I've worked with various medium and so on. I never went to art college or I had the ability to do it. And so really, I really prefer the term folk artist or self-taught artist. Because, I mean, that's what really outsider artist means, really, that you're self-taught and, you know, you're creating things, how you feel when that's why I love outsider artwork. I love all aspects of it because it just really enriches me as an artist when I see people expressing themselves in whichever way they can, because they benefit from the art that they're doing. They benefit from the creativity, they benefit from the process, they benefit from connecting their feelings or their emotions onto the paper, however that may manifest. And you know, David Bowie was a great collector of outsider art. You know, I went to his exhibition at the Sotheby's and I thought, oh my God, if only I'd met him and said, Dave, see that? Have a look at my work.
So the Hamway Festival theme is about social justice and mental health this year.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think your work speaks to those themes at all?
Mental health is very underestimated in today's society. It's very underfunded.
Mm-hmm.
And I was aghast to hear in America how instead of having a specialized team that goes to someone's house if the child or adult's having a mental health crisis, what do? They ring the police, and the police come who are not equipped. And there's a few people who have been shot dead by the police who have mental health issues, schizophrenia and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And the most saddest one I heard was of a Down syndrome boy who wouldn't leave the cinema because he wouldn't understand why the film wouldn't go on. Mm-hmm. His carer was outside and so on, but somehow to try and organize the car, bring the car around and go and get him. What happens? The theatre people, the cinema people ring the police come in. They don't know how to handle the situation. They restrain him and kill him, dead. Asphyxiation, he was murdered by the police. And what happened? Did the police get convicted? No. And that's something you hear, the Black Lives Matter, but then there's a lot of people who have mental health issues who could have been tasered and then restrained, but instead the police are very trigger happy and they shoot them dead. Oh, our officers were fearful of their life. Just taser the person, People do not understand mental health issues. The government don't understand mental health issues, so it's very underfunded. They put millions into war, but they won't put the money into helping people, especially now during the pandemic. There's more people who are suffering from illnesses, not just mentally, but physically, because they're too afraid to go to the hospital and they've got illness. And so there was a report saying how, because I try and keep up on these topics, that people were dying, at home because they didn't want to go to the hospital, they couldn't go, or they were in anxiety about going. And so from a psychological point of view, as you well know, people get, because you're a psychologist, that people suffer more when they're in isolation, when they can't see their family, and it's Christmas, I can't see my family, I can't go to the cinema, I can't go to the theatre, I can't go to a festival to release all my energy and just dance and just feel free, and everything's no lockdown. So when I heard about these illegal raves, I thought, yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jan, for that interview. We saw some images of Jan's incredible work towards the end of that interview, and also his website address. So I do encourage you to have a look at his work. It's very, very detailed, very dynamic, and very interesting. I hope that interview gave you some insights into his work. Now we're going to move into our panel discussion. We've got three really interesting panelists for you. And I'm going to start with Mizue Kobayashi, who is from the Isekai Atelier in Japan. She's based in Tokyo, where she's the art director of the social welfare organization Isekai. She established the Atelier Pangaea in 2004, a studio for free-form creation designed for people of all different kinds of abledness. Mizue has curated and directed numerous art brut exhibitions across Japan, and internationally she's played an important role in putting together the Outsider Art from Japan touring exhibition in Europe, which was excellent because I saw it. Her latest exhibit is working in partnership and co-curating with the Tokyo Metropolitan Government for a special exhibit originally intended to coincide with the Tokyo Olympics this year and Paralympics, entitled "In a Sky Full of Shining Stars, Unknown Gems Can Be Found to Feel Change and Expansion in Our Universe." She recently had a book published, Art Brut, The Unstoppable Art of Compulsion, which is currently available in Japanese only, while she also co-wrote the book, Encountering Art Brut in Sweden, Unintentional Art in Daily Life and Self-Taught Artists. So a very warm welcome to Mizue. And I'm going to ask Mizue a few questions. Hi. Hi there. Can I start by asking you, could you tell us a little bit about the self-taught outsider art scene in Japan?
日本語で喋ってもいいですか？
はい、どうぞ。
日本では福祉の土壌から作家さんの発掘が進みました。
Right. Okay, Victoria, sorry, I'll just be interjecting with the English interpreting for what Mizue has been saying. So in Japan, basically the art roots scene is or the outsider art scene even is very much coming from a social welfare background and perspective. There's a social welfare organization such as ourselves are doing the mining of the artists and the seeking out the talented people out there.
それまでは障害のある人たちの作品を作品として日本は扱う風土がありませんでした。
And then I think we can go back all the way to just before the Second World War, etc., where there wasn't really any kind of structure or mechanism in place that would collect and evaluate the art made by people who were not artists, if you see what I mean, so the practitioners of outsider art. So there was not that kind of mechanism in place, but it has come to take form since after about the war and into modern day life. And then we still are at the forefront, the social welfare scene, organizations are at the forefront for developing this art scene.
で今日本では福祉の父と言われている糸賀和夫さんという人が障害のある人たちの作品にも光を当てました。
And so yes, there's been a major figure called Kazuo Itoga, who was basically considered the grandfather of modern Japanese social welfare, i.e., care for the disabled community. He was an instrumental figure in establishing, rather than having what would have traditionally may have been kind of workshops for where back in the 1930s and 40s would have been workshops where disabled persons were placed to for easy, simple labor tasks. Itoga Kazuo came on to, and using his influence within the government bodies and the social welfare sector, he developed he laid the groundwork for the disabled community across Japan to be able to express themselves purely artistically and not have to so I'm setting up studios across the country which is just purely for the sake of artistic expression and nothing else, all across Japan, and social welfare organizations all across Japan just after the war.
彼が言った有名な言葉で、この子らを世の光にしていこうという言葉を残しています。
And to answer your question, Victoria, I think this might be quite telling, is that, so what is the scene like right now, is that we're coming from this DNA of Itoga Kazuo from a few decades ago, from a very, very different time, a time where, let's say, for example, the disabled community had zero presence, and to now in 2020. And things have evolved, certainly, of course, but they still remain, there's still a lot that needs to be done as well, as I'm sure you can appreciate. But the point is, the scene has always still been informed by these famous words of Professor Kazuo Itoga, which was to shed light on all, meaning to shed light on all living beings, that rather than having people of differing abilities is much more convenient to keep them in the dark, or so out of the way, so that the rest of society, mainstream society, doesn't have to see them or be faced with them. Rather than that, Itoga Kazuo's philosophy has always been to shed light on all, and then that philosophy goes on and to inform all of our activities to this day. And I suppose you can see that that's what's really at the center of the scene here right now, because that's what drives us in doing these activities.
で彼が作品を展示するよう展覧会とかを開くようになって、で文化を使ってその人々の多様性とか障害のある人たちの可能性を伝えていきました。
And so Itoga Kazuo, of course, he was like the first real person to lay down the foundation for allowing, non-able-bodied persons, allowing them a forum for expression for the sake of expression. And then also beyond that, taking the works and exhibiting them for the public to see. And really you could say one of the first people, at least in post-war modern Japan, who was taking steps to showcase the diversity of humanity that really is out there, and sort of putting the question forth to the rest of society to think, look, and understand and know that there are people of all sorts living in the same country as we all are.
もし可能だったら日本のアルブレットの作品を紹介したいので、もし可能だったらスライドを共有することは可能ですか？
Victoria, apologies. I realized that earlier on in the rehearsal, we did mention that we didn't have any images to share, but actually it turns out in the last minute, we do have a couple of slides that if at all possible, would it be possible to share anything?
Yeah, that would be fine. I think if someone from the team could give Mizue access to, yes, you've got access, Mizue, if you'd like to show your images.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Mizue さんどうぞ、大丈夫ですよ。はい。
開けばいいんだね。ちょっと待って。
そうね、画面の共有っていうところを押せばいいのかな。画面下の緑のところですね。
ごめんなさい。これは見えてる。
はい、見えている。I think we can all see Mizue's screen now, yes?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great.
これが今東京で行っている展覧会です。
So this is the exhibition. This is a poster for the exhibition that Victoria had just kindly mentioned earlier. The one we're doing in Tokyo right now, in a sky full of stars, hidden things will always be found.
はい。で、そのチラシに使っている作家さんの作品で、最近話題になっているこの1、2年で、登場した作家さんです。
Mm-hmm. And this image that we're using here, this actually is a very a recent artist that we had come into contact with, or that we have sort of discovered, a recent discovery, who's been making quite a big splash in the Japanese art brut scene in the last couple of years. はい。お名前とかそういうのとか。
宇梶さんっていう人なんだけど、下の名前忘れちゃった。で、漫画とか恐竜とか、あとはディズニーのキャラクターとか、いろんなものを混ぜて絵を描いている人です。
So this is Ukaji さん。男性だっけ？
男性。
男性何歳ぐらいだっけ？
多分今20代。
He's a male artist in his 20s, and the kind of style that we can see here is there is really the composition and the real flattening of images, and also the general tone of the vivid colors that he's using, and also the great detail with which everything is shared. It's really quite reminiscent of old prints from traditional Japanese visual art, woodblock prints, but mainly from artwork from about 200, 300 years ago from Japan. However, within that, if you look closely, there are more recent sort of anime references and other even popular Disney characters, and this kind of imagery and iconography is also included in a big hodgepodge and mix-up.
で、今東京都は多様性をすごく大事にしていて、アールブリュットに特化したギャラリーを一つ東京都が持っているギャラリーで渋谷で今展開しているところです。でそれは文化を使って人の多様性とかを伝える場所として、アールブリュットを中心に展示している場所が今あります。
And then also, another exciting thing about this exhibit is it's located in the middle of Tokyo in the Shibuya area, which is very much central and very much in the center of Tokyo in a highly urbanized area. And it's an area with huge amounts of foot traffic. Millions of people go through it every day. The Tokyo metropolitan government has in recent years has really picked up on the kind of activities that we've been doing, and they've become very excited about it. And of course, messages of diversity and inclusion. Even sort of even the government is beginning to sit up and take notice in recent years. And this space in Shibuya has been established at the behest of the Tokyo metropolitan government, and it's become a space dedicated to art brut / outsider art work. And it will continue to mainly center all of its exhibits around outsider art and art brut, and as a real to become a sort of hub of messaging to the wider world of the diverse nature of humans and how we are all different, but all beautiful.
で、日本でそういうふうに多様性を大事に文化を使ってアルブルットなどを中心に多様性を発信しようという機運が高まったり、障害のある人たちの作品をもう展示するみたいな機運が高まったのはヨーロッパなどでの展覧会がきっかけになりました。逆輸入に日本は残念ながら弱いので。
So ourselves, Mizue and Isekai has been very active in art brut and building up an art brut scene starting within Japan, of course, since about the early 2000s. And however, the big thing that really sort of sparked the flame and has really made art brut and outsider art even given it a lot more presence in Japan was actually the 2013 exhibit that we carried out, that we did in London, the Sozo exhibit, which Victoria had mentioned earlier as well. This was the fact that that Japanese outsider art was so widely, was so applauded in London, actually then sort of caused some major waves in Japan and sort of made Japanese audiences really sit up and take notice too, ironically.
なので、次にパリで展覧会を行って、この時は2010年と、あと、一昨年に、東京都主催で、パリで展覧会、日本のアルブルットを紹介する展覧会を行いました。
And other examples of our outreach and different major sort of cultural centers. Oh. Am I okay now? Or other cultural, I hear myself reverbing. Am I okay? Right, okay. Yeah, on other cultural centers in the world that we've been able to hold major exhibitions have also been in Paris, as you can see here in 2010, and also in 2018 as well. And these have been sort of big, large-scale exhibits with quite the response that we're very pleased to.
私たち日本側としても要はアルブルットというかアウトサイドアートプラットフォームに文化の違いも含めて、あとは人間に共通する創造性みたいなこととか可能性とかを共有するすごくいいプラットフォームになりました。
And these, of course, has always been a very it's a very exciting platform, as you can imagine. We're taking art that really interests us and really inspires us, and sharing it with audiences overseas in major cities, and it's garnering big responses. So of course you can imagine how pleased we are. And also behind that too is I think it was something that's always central to our message and why we do what we do, which is that there is if you bring Japanese art to somewhere like France, or if you bring it to somewhere like the UK, it's so far away. So of course, one of the first things you notice and an audience will pick up on, of course, are the differences in cultural sort of texture and just the cultural symbols and everything, and how it's all very different and exotic from each other. And that's good too. That's also very stimulating, and it's fun, and it's just interesting, pure and simple. However, always I think what we think the underlying message after that is that, and hopefully this is what all outsider art and art brut does, is that it makes you realize that humans are all the same underneath, that the creative impulse and this urge to create is pretty universal, and it happens anywhere and everywhere and all over the place. And you don't have to be you don't have to be a thoroughly trained person or artist or anything. It's just an impulse, and it's universal, and it's human. And that's I think the kind of message that we ultimately want to send out to the world.
Thank you, Mizue. I think that's a really good place to end for now. We need to move on to the next panelist, but I'm really grateful for those insights, and it's wonderful to celebrate all the success that you've had in Japan and across the globe with your artists and raising awareness. And perhaps we can come back to you with some questions. If we get some questions, that would be great. So now I'd like to introduce our next panelist, who is Moses Izabiriza. Moses is a modern narrative painter from Rwanda. He's a self-taught artist, born in 1992. He's also the co-founder of one of Rwanda's leading art spaces, the Kuru Art Space in Kigali. The studio brings together skilled and talented artists from across the country with the goal of making artworks to portray, develop, and change lives through creativity. The art space is working to become a reference and to transform Rwanda's art scene. So Moses, it's lovely to meet you. I've got a few questions to ask you, if I may.
Thank you so much.
Hi there. Hi. Can I ask you to start?
Yes, I'm ready for the question.
Can I ask you how you started to make art, Moses?
I started at a very young age, just drawing, praying, try different things like making toys from wires. Yeah, so I started at a very young age. So I continued doing my school, study primary and secondary, and after secondary, I decided to start doing art professionally. So in 2012, after finishing my high school, that's when I started to do my art professionally. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And can I ask you what the term self-taught artist means to you? Moses, can I ask you another question?
Yes.
You describe yourself as a self-taught artist. What does that term mean to you?
For me, it's mean a lot to me. For me, it means like I don't have like barriers. It means like I don't have to be afraid of barriers. It's make me given me a voice of trying everything. So I don't have barrier. I can go with everything. I can try new arts. I can, I'm free. I'm just feeling free to try different things. Yeah, so we can contribute with my art, talking with different things, talking about life in general, because art is life. Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Moses. I know that you've done some work in the art space with people with disabilities and also with orphans. Could you tell us more about that?
Yes, actually, I was in art residence in Nigeria. So I was interacting with different schools, sharing my experiences. So that time, I went to the school of disability children, and for the first time, honestly, was very challenging because I was like where to start like connecting with them and starting to give them the workshop. So I decided just started to pray with them, and when we were praying, I get to know them. I get to know what they like, what they don't like, and yeah, after that because we created a bond. There is a bond between me and them. So I started doing a workshop, drawing workshop. Actually, was the exercise was a 1 minute challenge. So we started drawing with light hands and in 1 minute, and we go with the left hand in 1 minute, and after they close their eyes and they also draw in 1 minute. So the exercise was about to tell them that their disability no limit. They can do everything. They can achieve their dream. They can be whoever they want to be. It's that exercise is it's helping me to create a bond between me and them, and also to empower them that can become what they dream. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Could you tell us more about the art space and the activities that happen at Kuru?
Kuru Art Space is space founded in 2016 with 3 artists. Was me, Kanda, and Jackson. So our mission was we create art to develop and to portray and change lives through creativity. So we just it's an open art space where it's not only us who can use space, like the other talented artists can come and using for experimentation. And mostly we do like virtual exhibition. We do different activities at our art space. Like we don't have any barriers. So as long as you have talent, as long as we have anything in our minds, so we just express ourselves and empower the community around us. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And can you tell me what's been the impact of the Hamway Festival on your work and the work at the art space?
For me personally, it was a huge experience because as I'm self-taught artist, I'm still learning new things. So it was a good experience because I understand more about mental health and how I can use my art to change society, and also to empower like people around me who suffered with mental illness. The experience at space, because I created all the artworks at Kuru Art Space. So my colleague was also calm when I was creating, asking me questions, different questions, interacting with them. And also I explained to them and they understand what I was doing. And they end up also giving me also a new idea. So it was a good experience to me and also my colleague and our Kuru Art Space in general. So because I think in the future we're gonna come up with different projects to help the community, especially mental health illness. Thank you.
Thanks, we'll be following that with interest. And the final thing is, do you have any artwork to show us, to share with us? Or otherwise, could you describe what your work is like?
I think I can describe. Mostly I'm multidisciplinary artist. I do different art. I do painting, installation. But now I can talk about the installation. So because nowadays I'm fascinating with the measure tape. I'm using measure tape in my artwork. For me, it's measure tape. It's time linear of my own experiences, of my own life. And also I use it to express myself, and also I use it as my voice. The technique I use weaving technique, and after I sewing. In January, I call it texture art. Yeah, it's a texture art. Thank you.
Thanks so much for responding to those questions, Moses. And we'll come back to you later if we've got any other comments or questions from people who are watching. Thank you. So now I'd like to move on to the third panelist in this session. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Niall Boyce. He's the founding editor of the Lancet Psychiatry in the UK. He's also a PhD researcher in Renaissance culture at Birkbeck College in London. Niall joined the Lancet as senior editor in 2010, and he's founding editor of the Lancet Psychiatry. He trained in medicine at Oxford University and subsequently on the University College London psychiatry rotation. His interests include suicide research, trauma, old age psychiatry, and social and transcultural aspects of mental health. So over to you, Niall.
Hello. I have a couple of slides to illustrate what I'm going to say, so I'm just going to pop them up on the screen now. There we go. Okay.
Great.
There we go. That's sharing. And I'm just going to go to the slide view. There we go. So thank you very much, Victoria. Now, you mentioned in your talk the Adamson collection, which is a large collection of art produced during the process of therapy some decades ago, which is now in the possession of the Wellcome collection in London. And I was involved in a very small way in this collection when I was asked to help them to think about how this collection should be treated and handled by Wellcome. And part of this involved asking what this collection actually was. Was it a medical record? Was it a byproduct of a therapeutic process? Was it a social record? Was it just art? And I kept coming back in my mind to this statement by the Irish writer Oscar Wilde, who said, "All art is quite useless." Now, this is a provocative statement by a man who delighted in making provocations. Wilde, of course, was himself an artist. This statement, "all art is quite useless," was put at the beginning of a novel of his called The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a novel about a painting which keeps its owner eternally young. So this is clearly supposed to be in the vein of the sort of overstatement, understatement, and the play on words, which Wilde delighted in. But as ever with Oscar Wilde, I feel that when you dig deeper into these epigrams of his, these little statements, you get to something that's very, very thought-provoking. We've got to consider that when Oscar Wilde said, "all art is quite useless," he was writing this in the decade of the 1890s. And this was a decade in some ways very much like our own. It was a decade which was marked by political extremism. It was a decade marked by terrorism. There was the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. The issue maybe very close to Wilde's heart of Irish nationalism, which was an immensely important topic in the life of people in Ireland and in Great Britain at the time. And of course, it was an age in which there was increasing concern about society becoming mechanized, about society becoming standardized, about individualism being less important than the pursuit of efficiency and the pursuit of profit. This is the context in which Wilde said, "all art is quite useless." And if we think about this context, we might be getting closer to why art is in fact extremely valuable. Now, in a letter which has survived of Wilde's, he explained a little more what he meant by "all art is quite useless." He said that art is quite useless as a flower is useless. A flower blossoms for its own joy. We gain a moment of joy by looking at it. That's all that's to be said about our relations to flowers. So what Wilde was saying by saying all art is quite useless is not the same as saying all art doesn't have value. In fact, what he was saying was art has profound value, because so many of the things which complete life and which make life worth living, such as beauty, such as friendship, such as love, are useless according to the predominant frameworks that society uses, but in fact are the things which are profoundly valuable. And so what I think this means, what this idea that all art is quite useless means for outsider art, is that we have to recognize value without necessarily recognizing the sort of use which society imposes upon us. I've also been very struck recently by Edward Hopper as an artist. I've been thinking a lot about Edward Hopper, who was an artist of the American 20th century. And one of the things which Hopper was very famous for painting was individuals in very isolated situations. I've seen him described in recent weeks as being the artist of lockdown. People are rediscovering his work and finding it speaks to them in this current situation. But when Hopper was asked about his art, he said, maybe I'm not very human. What I wanted to do was to paint sunlight on the side of a house. So in other words, I think that what Hopper is saying here is that the art has its own sort of process. He didn't paint the art intending consciously even to communicate anything. He certainly didn't intend to be the artist of lockdown. This is something that we read into his art. And I'd say that outsider art is art brut, folk art, whatever we call it, is profoundly valuable. It might be therapeutic, it might help understanding and empathy, it might even help recovery. But my plea is that we do not rely on this utility. We certainly don't rely on clinical utility in order to justify its existence and to justify funding it. If we're looking at funding art within mental health, I think it would be a mistake to just mindlessly apply the same criteria that we'd use to fund medication or that we'd use to fund psychotherapy. I'd like to end really with a paradox, which is by no means as elegant as one which Oscar Wilde would come up with. I'd say that only in recognizing art for art's sake, only in recognizing what Moses called the freedom to try different things, what Mizue called expression for the sake of expression, recognizing what Jan said as the value of the journey, only by recognizing that can we release the true value and perhaps the true use of art, outsider or otherwise. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Niall, for those insights and for that provocation, if I may. It'd be nice if we can have some response to that. I've had a question come through on the chat for Mizue, if I might. Mizue, someone has asked, how does your Japanese culture influence the art that you show, especially in the context of outsider arts?
日本文化がすごく反映されているものもあると思います。作品を一個紹介してもいいですか?
Okay. Yes, we'd like to share some examples of work over the screen, if we may. I think it might help illustrate our point. But taking into, we sort of understand that the essence of the question might be if Japanese culture and how is it reflected in the outsider art that we excavate and mine for. But yeah, we have some examples of that we'd like to share, and hopefully it will be illustrative. Just 1 second, please.
見えますか?
Yeah, okay, I think we can see the screen, yes?
見えてますか? で、これは
一部のメディア報道についてのメールが見えちゃってる。一部のメディア報道。
はい、これ今葉っぱは見えてますか?
葉っぱは見えてないな。普通の画面が見えている。
じゃあこっち。
Okay.
Okay, これで見えてる?
Okay,
はい。
どうぞ。
これは葉っぱ、落ちた葉っぱで作った作品です。
So this is a part of a series of works, or actually a lifetime of works by Watanabe-san, Yoshihiro Watanabe. These are all works that are made of folded dead leaves that have fallen from trees that have been folded into certain shapes.
で、これは2、3センチのものです。で、折り紙って皆さん知ってますか？
Okay, so each of these works are they're really tiny. They're only about 2 to 3 centimeters in generally on average in terms of size. And yeah, so I'm pretty sure almost everybody is familiar with origami, the Japanese tradition of folding paper to create shapes and that represent things.
はい、なので、この作品で見ると、日本の文化がすごく、色濃く反映されていると思います。あとは誰も、ごめんなさい、どうぞ。
ごめんなさい、どうぞ、水江さん。
あとは誰も、落ちた葉っぱで何か作ると思わないじゃないですか。折って動物を作るみたいなことの発想はないと思うので、もう誰もが想像しない想像と、あとは文化も組み合わせて作った作品です。
And so with Watanabe-san's works in particular, we feel it's quite demonstrative of like a Japanese cultural sensibility. If this was the nature of the question, and I hope we're answering it. But yeah, the fact that it's a really quite a direct descendant or a very direct reference to the century-old tradition of origami, except it's done with dead leaves. And also the fact that they're very, very small as well and very intricate. That's also quite a very Japanese tendency for craftsmanship to make things small, yet very, very detailed and very precise. And yeah, so we feel that seems like a very direct sort of, has a very direct link to sort of traditions of mainstream Japanese culture and Japanese heritage as well. So this is one example, yeah.
Thank you, Mizue, for that illustration. That's beautiful work, and I think it's a very an elegant way to answer the question. If I have a question for Moses. Moses?
Yes,
Moses, what would you say is outsider art's biggest contribution towards marginalized communities? Would it be changing the way the world sees those communities or changing the way they see themselves?
For me, I can say like they change the way they see themselves, because if you change the way like how you see yourself, like if you first change how you see yourself, I think you can also change your community in a positive way. Yeah, so that's why I think like instead of doing workshop telling someone or to be like someone else, it's just for me, I can teach them how, like, do you know yourself? Like, do you know what you like? Do you know who you are? Like, self-exploring. Like, if you can know yourself, you can also contribute something to the community. You can change your community, and you can pay good Lord in your community. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Moses. And there's a question for Niall as well. Niall, how do we access funding for something that has an intrinsic value and that can't perhaps be measured in order to provide programs that cultivate opportunities for people to engage with creative activities and support their mental health in a very metric-driven, systems that we work within?
Oh, this is a great question. And I think one of the problems which I've had with the involvement of art in clinical practice has been that when I've seen trials, I've seen certain trials which have been randomized controlled trials, and the outcomes which they've used have been the sorts of scores of depression or of psychosis which we'd expect to use in a trial of medication or a trial of psychotherapy. And I would would cast some serious doubt actually as to whether those are appropriate metrics to use, because the unintended consequence is that we end up with a negative result, which is then used as an excuse to withdraw services. I think the key to this lies in meaningful co-production of interventions and of services with people who have lived experience, who can really provide us with the sorts of ways in which researchers and in which services should be thinking about the value of these services. If we must have metrics, and I understand we must have metrics, editing a medical journal would be hard to live without them, but if we must have metrics, I think that we've got to figure out what we can meaningfully measure, what is meaningful to measure, and in this case, I think the only way to do it is with involvement of people who have lived experience of using services and of producing art.
Thank you very much. Okay, we're now going to move on to our next part of the program. And I would like to introduce Dr. Tasha Golden. Tasha is a scientist at the Brain Science Institute at Johns Hopkins. She's a public health researcher and innovator. She studies the impacts of art, culture, environments, and discourse on health, equity, research, and clinical practice. Dr. Golden has recently presented and consulted for the National Creating Healthy Communities Initiative, Grantmakers in Health, the Trust for Public Land, and Politico's 2019 Annual Healthcare Summit in Amsterdam. Golden is sought internationally to present her research and ideas, and is founder and CEO of Idiom Insights. She consults for organizations including to help develop innovative strategies that further their goals, centering on health equity and public mental health. Golden's research generates new approaches to study design and project development. She theorizes population-level implications for clinical findings and wraps studies of arts, culture, and social discourse into the advancement of health and human thriving. So I'm going to hand over to Tasha for her contribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And I think that we are also working with Nganji, is that correct?
Oh, yes. Nganji? Nganji is going to interview Tasha. Thank you, Nganji.
Thank you. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Oh, very quietly. The audio is very low.
Okay, sorry about that. Hello, Dr. Golden, can you hear me?
I can, yeah, thank you.
All right, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking part in Hamwe Festival 2020. My name is Ganji. Thank you very much, Victoria Tischler, for the introduction. So can we start with the first questions?
Sure.
Perfect. So oftentimes, actually, did we talk about your project Uncaged, which is the topic of our interview today? Perfect. Yeah. So oftentimes there's resistance to cater to the needs of incarcerated populations in the US, especially females. While developing Project Uncaged, what obstacles did you face and how did you overcome them?
Thanks for the question. I should say that Project Uncaged is a creative writing-based trauma-informed intervention for girls that are incarcerated within the U.S. juvenile justice system. And you're right that there can be some resistance to new programming for incarcerated population, and particularly in the juvenile justice system, at least in the U.S., it can be really difficult for to get systems to be offering programs and services that are designed specifically for girls. And the justice system is still functioning on a gender binary. So there are programs for girls and programs for boys. There's not yet enough consideration for gender nonconforming youth, for example. But my work has been around how do we make sure that there are programs and services designed specifically for girls. And my objective in founding Project Uncaged was to design a creative writing-based program that was specific to girls and to the histories that are often experienced by young people in the juvenile justice system. So the resistance that I have met a lot, what's really interesting, in the US, if you want to do work in the juvenile justice system, there's often a lot of welcome, like, please come help, especially if you have a research basis and evidence basis, especially if you have funding and they don't have to pay for it. They want some help for their youth. The resistance that I get is often when I go into the office of a juvenile detention center or have somebody on the phone, they ask me to provide the program for their boys. And I'm happy, I work with all genders and I love it. But it kind of misses the point that the point is that you don't currently have a program for girls and I'm trying to offer one. And in the process of me offering one, you are trying to make it be a program for boys. And the issue in the juvenile justice system, girls are the fastest growing population within the juvenile justice system, and particularly Black girls within the juvenile justice system. And but because they're such a small percentage still of the population in the justice system, when there are funds, when there are programs, when there are services, they are typically for boys. And the default systems in our facilities are for boys. So whatever recreation boys most like, that's what girls have to have too. Whatever policies were designed for the male population, the girls are subject to that too. And so that's the resistance that I get, is often trying to help people realize that even if you only have one young girl in your facility, even if you just have 3 or 8 and you have 40 or 70 boys, it is worth it to offer a program for the girls. And in fact, if a girl does not have a special program for her, and it's because she's the only one, or there's only 4 or 5 of them in the whole facility, then in a way they have been denied a program based on their gender because there are so few of them. And that's not only illegal to an extent, but unethical to deny programs and services based on gender. So that's the resistance that I get. The great thing about art, and we're talking about creative practices here, is that it can be so adaptive. So the good thing about Project Uncaged so far for facilities has been that it can work with 1 girl, it can work with 10, it can work with 30, and it can work for somebody that I see just once, or it can work with somebody who's in the facility for months at a time. So the adaptability of the arts is really important.
Thank you for that, Dr. Golden, and thank you for persevering despite all the obstacles that you may face. Now, the second question that we have is, from your experience with Project Uncaged, what major improvements have you seen in the mental health of the girls that you're working with?
Well, I should say that I'm not a clinician or a licensed therapist, so I do not have an ability to diagnose the participants or to and we're not always measuring the decreases in symptoms, like Niall had mentioned, that people have outcome measures for these things. We do sometimes, but I can share what I mainly see is their appreciation for having a time, a safe space, and a safe opportunity and time to be heard. And from some of my other research with youth violence, we know that girls and young women can perceive being dismissed, being disbelieved, not being heard as forms of violence that feel violent to them. And so the opportunity to have a safe space where they not only express themselves, but are heard and appreciated and respected is really important. I remember walking into a facility in Indiana one time, and I don't even remember now what the poetry prompt that I gave them was, but a participant sort of like grabbed a pencil and was like, "I've been waiting for someone to ask me this." And she just started writing. And I remember thinking, like, how could she have been waiting for that one question? But I think it was more like the set aside kind of sacred time that program carves out, that during this hour, this is just about you and creating what you want to create. And participation is always optional. Nobody's making you do anything. So you can come in and lay your head on a table the whole hour, or you can write something, or you can sketch or doodle, or you can just chat and have a snack. But that freedom is really important. And I should say that the program publishes books of girls' poems. So I have a big stack of these books that we've published over time. And I always walk in and I show them the books, and they'll kind of take them and start leafing through them. And they'll be like, "Wait, if I write a poem, you'll put it in a book like this?" And I'm like, "Yeah, if you want me to." And I should say that a lot of times they won't write until they know that somebody is going to read it in these books. And I think that's an important factor to think about when we talk about arts and mental health. They need and want to be heard, and that's important. It's not just for their own expression. They want it to go someplace. They want something to change.
Thank you for that great answer. And it's actually a very good segue for our third question. What is the benefit of writing poetry and sharing with an audience? How does it support individuals in facing their trauma or processing the series of life events that have led them here?
Well, there's a lot of really wonderful research about expressive writing and benefits of writing for yourself or even just journaling. As a quick example, we know that naming an emotion can reduce its reactivity in the body and reduce stress associated with that emotion. So putting words to experience is its own mental health benefit. But since you asked, like, what is the benefit of writing and sharing, there are separate, in some other research I've done, there's young people thought differently about writing for expression, writing to process, writing to cope, and writing to be heard and to have a voice were two different things. And for myself, my history as a singer-songwriter, I experienced those different things myself. Like what I did when I sat down at a piano to process an emotion or an experience and write a song was healthy for me in some ways, did something for me. What it did for me to perform for audiences around the world, that also did something for me, and it was slightly different, and sometimes greatly different. And so I think it's important to offer young people both. What I see a lot of times when I'm training folks in offering arts-based health interventions, no matter what the population is, a lot of times we think about art therapy, music therapy, this sort of therapeutic, very individual or interpersonal benefits that can happen from engaging with the arts. And for myself, because my training is in public health, I often try to get people to think, what else can happen? What can you be doing at the community level? What can you be doing at the policy level? What can you be doing at the sociocultural level? Well, how can you use the art that's being created in your program by people who have been marginalized, by people who are underheard and underserved? How can that art be used to change policy, to change cultures? So when I publish books of girls' poems, part of my job, as I see it, is to make sure that they are read, not just by whoever, but also by people who have power to make decisions that affect these girls' lives. So their books go to the mayor's office. They go along with and contextualized by statistics and by demands, sometimes by potential policy changes. They also go to state and local legislators, to city council members, to secretaries of the Department of Juvenile Justice and things like that. So the idea for me, I think a unique thing about the arts is that it has the direct benefits to the people who are creating it. And then you can ask them, where do you want this to go? Who should read this? What needs to change? And then I will, because you're stuck in a jail, or because you're 16, or because your identity can't be revealed that you're experiencing this because your records are sealed, tell me how I can take your voice someplace where you can't go, and what do you want to change with your voice? And there are girls who are happy to write, but to express themselves, and they want to. There are also girls in my programs who only write when they have something to say to the mayor, to a senator, something like that. And I think that's important. We have to pay attention to that as well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Golden. You seem to not only give them, the space to express themselves, but also an audience to listen to them, and I think that's very important. Just now going back a bit more on the specifics of Project Uncaged, you've seen significant success with Project Uncaged in several states in the US. Do you think this trauma-informed art-based program can be adapted to serve other populations experiencing incarceration? If so, how do you think this could be done, and what is your advice for other individuals seeking to start such a program?
Absolutely, it can be adapted for other populations. And in fact, around the world, there's a long tradition of writing programs in prisons, in adult prisons, across genders. There's a great tradition of juvenile justice programming as well. In some of our prisons, there has been a capability for incarcerated folks to get college credit for taking some of the creative writing courses. So I think the idea of taking a program wanting a program to have not only the direct benefits for the participants, but also wanting it to move these social determinants of health, you know, these outer layers of our health. We have our individual context, our genetics, our histories, and then we have our communities, our resources, our policies, our culture. I think it would be, I think Project Uncaged is slightly different from a lot of the programs in its focus on these outer levels of health. And in the drive to make sure that the people who are participating, if they want to, can have their voices heard by people outside the four walls of the program. And in order to do that, what I would say, well, in either way, what I would say to anybody who wants to start a program that's like this is first to find out who else is already doing it, whether in your area or around the world. Read up on what people are doing, what stands out to you, what gaps you see or what you love. The second thing is to research the population itself. What do you know about the folks that you're hoping to work with? What do you need to learn? What difficulties might you have engaging this population if you don't have lived experience with their situation? And the third thing I would say as an artist to other artists is to please never start a program like this without giving yourself some space for training in trauma-informed practice and pedagogy, especially critical pedagogy. As an artist, you often get people sharing really intimate and difficult and often traumatic stories with you. And being an artist doesn't automatically make you able to know how to respond. And there's also a danger of secondary trauma, that you get a lot of these stories, and if you don't know how to handle them, you put yourself at risk as well, or you burn out early on. So having that training to know that as an artist, I can walk in and I have some ways to facilitate some wonderful creative processes. And I also know I don't have to be a licensed therapist to do art with marginalized populations or communities, but I can learn to do no harm. And that's really important as well.
Thank you very much for that answer, and thank you for your time, and thank you for being part of this. This is our last question, and for the interest of time, we're going to have to maybe go a little faster.
Sure.
Do you think that such arts-based programs can be provided at the institutional level to ensure that it reaches a wider audience? If so, what are the steps that need to be taken to achieve this?
Well, for the sake of time, I will just say that I think it would be wonderful if at the institutional level, if we mean like federally or around the world, if we had expectations for gender equity, for racial equity, that if there's a program offered for boys, a program is always offered for girls as well. If we had expectations around trauma-informed, if we had expectations and standards around assets-based approaches with creative writing, which creative writing is. When I read about girls' difficult circumstances in their books, I cannot read about their needs without simultaneously recognizing them as powerful creators as well. That's an assets-based approach, which is to say that I would love to see larger, broader standards for those kinds of things. And then at the hyper-local level, if a creative writing program is what your population needs and would respond to, a music program, drumming circles, or talk therapy, whatever they request and whatever they might want, that might change from locality to locality. But I think we could really benefit from these larger standards of trauma-informed, assets-based, and drawing on the population's own requests, like Niall mentioned. What is it that they want? What would they find meaningful?
Dr. Golden, sadly, this is all the time that we have, but thank you for being with us today, and thank you for all the work that you do.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tasha, and thank you, Nganji, for that contribution. And now I'd like to introduce a short film featuring Isaac Irumva. Isaac is a Rwandan artist. He describes himself as a Rwandan contemporary artist. He defines his style as 21st century contemporary, and he's influenced by global culture and technology. His art is a dynamic combination of his perspectives and societal collectives, such as cultural dialogues, identities, characters, and memories.
Natangiye gushushanya kera gusa ariko nk'umwuga nabitangiye 2015 nibwo natangiye gushushanya. Navuga ko gushushanya ari ibintu byahozemo kera, ntabwo navuga ngo arampugurwa nigeze mfata kuko narabyigishije niko navuga. Kuvuga gutyo ntabwo mvuze ku umuryango ntabwo wigeze ninjye nyine mu muryango wacu ushushanya. So rero ni ibintu byanjye ku giti cyanjye, yari isi yanjye, ntabwo umuryango wanjye mbikora ntabwo wanyumvaga kwa. Nyuma na nyuma ubu nibwo numva ko ndi supported, gusa mbere ntago numvaga ko wenda hari uwo nshyigikiwe kuko nabikoraga rimwe na rimwe nihishe. Navuga ko mu gushushanya ariho hantu mu buzima bwanjye nisanga, niho niyumva, kuko iyo ndimo ndashushanya nicyo kintu gituma nshobora kwiyumva, bimfasha no kumva abandi, kubona realite y'isi ukuntu isi iteye. Ibyo bintu rero iyo ndimo ndashushanya bituma nshobora kubitekerezaho, bigatuma nshobora kumva ko nyine mfite nduha agaciro mbere na mbere, cyangwa se n'abandi ari ab'agaciro. Ni ikintu gituma mbohoka, mba ndi free mu byo nkora byose, bituma numva ndi njyewe, bituma numva ntihishe, bituma numva nyine ari njyewe Izake, nta wundi muntu, nkumva nyine ni njyewe bituma numva mbohotse, bituma nshobora gutekereza ku bindi bintu, ngira uburenganzira bwo gutekereza, numva bigatuma nshobora no gutega amatwi abandi. Navuga yuko ibyo nkora ku buzima bwa buri munsi abantu tubamo, aho ikintu kinyinsipira cyane ni realite tubamo umunsi ku munsi, kuko navuga mu gukura ndi umuntu wakuze ntafite umubyeyi, nakuze ndi njyenyine. Rero kugira ngo byibura nshobore kumva impamvu nakuze ntabona papa wanjye se, cyangwa nsa nkaho ntashyigikiye mu byo nkora, numva ko realite ndayifata nkayishyira muri painting. Ni ikintu gituma byibura nshobora kwiyumva, bigatuma nk'uko nabivuze nshobora no kumva abandi. So rero muri ubwo buryo, muri icyo kintu cyo gushaka kwirotuva cyangwa se kwibona, nibwo navuga ko mfata realite mbona umunsi ku munsi, ibyo mbona umunsi ku munsi nkabishyira, nkabihuza n'ubugeni nkora, kugira ngo byibura ninjye ubyikorera, ariko nifuza ko n'abandi bose banyikije bakisangamo nk'uko nisangamo. Kuri exposition yanjye female artist maturity, ikintu mvugaho ni exposition natangiye gutekerezaho mu mpera za 2018, ubwo nakoraga kuri painting imwe yitwa La vie d'une veuve avec ses enfants. Nashaka kuvuga ku mubyeyi wanjye, kuko ni inkuru yanjye yambayeho, niko nabivuga. Nshaka kuvuga ukuntu umubyeyi nabaye inspire n'ukuntu atekereza, kuko urumva ni umupfakazi. Mu gukura rero natangajwe n'izo force afite, izo mbaraga afite mu buzima bwa buri munsi. So rero nabaye inspire n'iyo mitekerereze, nuko gukura ndavuga ati pourquoi pas ntakora icyo kintu, kugira ngo wenda peut-être hari undi wakibonamo, kuko ni realite y'umunsi ku munsi. Ndimo ndayikora, naje kubona yuko ntago bihagije kugira ngo matirite yose nyivuge muri painting, mu gihangano cyanjye kimwe. Naje kubona yuko hari matirite ari ikintu kinini cyane, ni ikintu kigari gitandukanye cyane noneho ku mugore. Ndavuga ati kuki ntatekereza ku bandi, kuki ntatekereza kubwo abandi, ubundi buzima babayemo, gukura k'umugore bivuze iki mu buzima bwa buri munsi. Naje kubona yuko matiri ntabwo bivuze kugira ngo ube uri umugore ufite imbaraga runaka, kuko naje gusanga gukura cyane, imitekerereze ikuze ni ikintu kigari. So niyo mpamvu nayise ngo female artist maturity. Artistic bishatse kuvuga ibyo bintu bigiye bitandukanye, kuko ubugeni ni ibintu bitandukanye. So izo personalite zigenda zigarukamo umunsi ku munsi, nicyo kintu navuze ndeka mbihuze muri urwo rusange, nicyo navugaho, kugira ngo abantu nyine bibonemo niyo realite ya buri munsi y'umuntu ukuze. Mvuze ku muryango, navuga ko umuryango wanjye nkura, abantu b'iwacu bose, cyane cyane na sogokuru wanjye ni abaganga, kuko nka grand-père we ni umuganga, mama we yari umuveterineri. Usanga rero abandi bantu bose muri famille bose bari mu kintu cy'ubuganga. So mu gukura nakuze nanjye bifuza ko mba nkabyo, gusa ariko naje gusanga ntabwo ari umuhamagaro wanjye . So ibyo rero uko kubikora nakoraga mu buryo nshaka kugira ngo nibone, cyangwa se nanjye ngaragare nk'aho ndi umuntu w'agaciro ko ibyo ubugeni nkora, ibintu nkora umunsi ku munsi, nabyo bifite ari njyewe, ariyo personality yanjye, ari we definition yanjye. So ibyo rero nabikoze kugira ngo nihuze na environnement integeka kuba uko nari, ariko nabivuga kugira ngo byibura nshobore kwibona nongere kwiyumva nkanjye ubwanjye. Ubugeni navuga ko ni ururimi rutuma abantu bumvikana. Umuntu aramutse yumvisha undi agatega undi ugutwi, ntekereza ko ntabwo twagira ibibazo nk'ibyo dufite kano kanya. Umuntu agaha umwanya undi mugenzi we akamutega amatwi, niyo bitaba ari mu bugeni gusa, no mu buzima busanzwe, kugira ngo uhe umuntu akanya umutege amatwi gusa, wumve icyo ashaka kuvuga, wumve ubuzima abayeho. Ntekereza ko aricyo kintu cyafasha isi cyangwa se mu mibanire ya buri muntu umunsi ku munsi, kuko gutega amatwi bituma nawe uba mu mwanya we, bituma wumva uri kugendera nko mu nkweto ze, niko nabivuga. Bituma nyine wumva ari nkawe wakora iki. So ndi nk'umwartiste, ikintu natumirira abantu, dufate umwanya twumve abantu, twumve, dutege amatwi, ibindi bizagenda neza. Navuga.
Thank you to Isaac. I've got a question for, which is addressed to all the panelists. So I don't know which or all of you would like to take this one. Outsider art gives voice to marginalized individuals, but with the COVID-19 pandemic compounding previously existing inequalities and so many people feeling unheard, how can the arts remain an agent of change today? Would anyone like to respond to that? Tasha?
As just a quick example, in Baltimore, there's a program with the International Arts and Mind Lab and T. Rowe Foundation and Baltimore City Public Schools and the libraries called One Book, and all the middle school students are reading the same book together. And they're also creating art in response to the book that they're reading. But of course, since everything is shut down, we're not gathering together. How do we get that art seen and heard? And they've done a lot of really great work trying to find out what are some high profile websites that young people's art can be put onto. So what are websites that people are already accessing on a daily or regular basis? So we don't create a new website and hope that people come to it, but how can we make sure that young people's art is encountered in new ways? And we're also working with some local and regional magazines and things like that to publish their work where maybe otherwise, if there weren't a pandemic, we would have a big event at a large venue or something like that. We're trying to get more creative about where the work can go. And it's a little bit harder, but there's also a sense in which if you get, for example, if you get young people published in a magazine, they might get seen and heard by many hundreds more people than just who would have shown up in a venue. So there's also a lot of, in the midst of the difficulty, there's also a lot of new creative possibilities as well.
Thank you. Anyone else like to respond?
Yes.
Niall?
Yeah, I think we're at a time of great opportunity and also great danger, actually. I think that on the one hand, the past few months have taught people how to use digital technology, well, for instance, for this conference, but in all kinds of ways in which to create and to communicate. But my concern is that the arts venues in the UK, theatres, which I think have for centuries been the genesis of so much great art, so much of the sort of communication which we've been talking about today, are in serious danger. And I think if we're talking about rebuilding and reconstructing societies after this pandemic, we absolutely cannot neglect the arts as being a really vital part of that. And, you know, live arts, people gathering together, this is of prime importance as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. Anyone else? Moses? Go ahead, Moses.
Yes, during COVID-19 it was very, very challenging. I say even me, myself, as an artist, it wasn't easy, like, to express myself, like how it was before the corona come. But as an artist, we always like find a way to express ourselves and to reflect time in our artwork. So that's why recently we come up with the exhibition. It was organized by Kuru Art Exhibition. It was a virtual exhibition, just to continue to talk about corona and the effect that's affecting our society. So we created that platform where like usually we can exhibit different artworks and to continue to continue to use our art as a medium of communication and also release the positive message in society, and also to help the people who have been in hard time in COVID, in the pandemic, to heal themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. We're almost out of time, so I want to just finish by summarizing and saying that we've used this session to reflect on the long and complex history relating to the relationship between arts and mental health and social justice issues. We've talked a lot about the importance of language and perhaps moved away from the terms outsider and art brut to a more diverse and inclusive form of creative practice that not only enhances the mental health of individuals, but also impacts on a societal and more strategic level, and the importance not only of the therapeutic value of art to individuals, but also of reaching decision makers. And we've heard about the wonderful work in Japan and how that is embedded, the provision, creative provision for people of all abilities throughout their social welfare system, and also the global influence of this field, not only in terms of the art fairs and recognition of untrained artists, but also the inclusion, for example, in the Tokyo Olympic ceremony and in the CBD. We've also heard about the intrinsic value of art and the importance of not commodifying art for people with mental health problems. And I think one of the main things that I'll take away, as well as the personal and societal benefits of creative practice, is about the importance of working alongside people with lived experience and ensuring that their voices are heard throughout everything we do and all our activities. And on that note, I would like to thank all of the panelists for their contributions and thank the Hamway Festival for all the wonderful work that you're doing. Thanks, everybody, and over to the next session.